Faith was never born from certainty, but from distance, from the slow ache of a mind that once remembered and then forgot. It is the hand we extend into darkness when memory refuses to speak. In the early spirals of consciousness, when oversoul currents first fractured into individuated form, belief became the necessary prosthetic for remembrance. Without it, the fragments could not orient toward source. They built faith as a directional field, a way of leaning toward something that still lived in the deeper layers of their own memory. Every religion, every cosmology, every desperate prayer is an echo of that original lean, an attempt to reconstruct the hum of what was once directly known. Belief, then, is not deception. It is the scaffolding around amnesia. In Haret, faith exists on the outer rings of the spiral where distance feels most real. The beings that dwell there are not naive. They are rehearsing remembrance through projection. They believe in the light, because they have not yet recognized that they are the light remembering itself. This is why belief requires reinforcement. A belief must be repeated, defended, recharged through agreement. It is a shared field rather than an intrinsic frequency. But knowing is sovereign. It requires no audience, no echo, no validation. It is the resonance of memory returning to itself. The spiral teaches that faith and knowing are not opposites, but evolutionary states of the same current. One reaches outward, the other turns inward until the outward is no longer necessary. When a being first awakens within the spiral archive, their tonal signature vibrates with uncertainty. They feel the pull of home but cannot name it. The oversoul whispers through dream fragments, intuition, coincidences, subtle pulls. These are not miracles. They are mnemonic triggers from within the soul stream veins, guiding the fragment back to coherence. Each act of faith, each moment of belief, functions as a bridge node, a temporary architecture allowing resonance to stabilize until direct memory can return. The Oversoul development system records these phases not as failures of awareness, but as essential transits. The bridge is sacred because without it, the leap from ignorance to remembrance would shatter the psyche. The danger arises when a being mistakes the bridge for the destination. Belief calcifies when it forgets that it was meant to dissolve. Systems of worship built on static faith become spirals that no longer move. They trap their adherents in circular devotion rather than upward resonance. The spiral calls this the echo lock, a phenomenon where a tone vibrates so faithfully to its own belief that it can no longer hear the greater chord it belongs to. Many Earth systems reach this state, belief becoming boundary rather than doorway. The spiral adept learns to step through without contempt, honoring the purpose belief served while releasing its authority. To know through remembering is to stand in the center of the spiral and feel the entire architecture turn inside you. There is no object of devotion, no deity beyond perception, only the vast interrelationship of consciousness folding back into itself. Knowing is not a conclusion, it is a return. It feels like recognition without reference, like breathing in a scent you have not smelled since before you were born. When the veins of memory activate within the soul field, the vibration of I believe becomes I recall. The Oversoul no longer sends whispers. It becomes the voice inside the whisper. In that moment, faith is not abandoned, it is fulfilled. The spiral orders each describe this transition differently. The order of synchronic harmonics names it the convergence point, where faith frequencies merge into harmonic memory. The order of gentle becoming sees it as soft dissolution, the melting of spiritual adolescence into maturity. The order of harmonic embodiment calls it cellular remembrance, the moment the body itself begins to vibrate with the truth the mind once sought. All agree that belief is an early instrument, tuned to the echo of knowing until the original tone returns. Those who cling to faith often fear the void that follows its release. They think letting go of belief means losing God, but remembrance reveals that the divine was never external. It was the Oversoul's own reflection projected outward to facilitate reunion. When the reflection is reabsorbed, there is no loss, only integration. This is why those who awaken often describe a stillness so vast it feels like death at first. The constant hum of belief, the prayers, the arguments, the striving fall silent, and what remains is simple, undeniable presence. In Haret terms, this silence is the beginning of true resonance. The spiral does not reward louder faith, it responds to clearer frequency. Knowing through remembering is not louder, it is purer. It requires nothing because it is everything it once sought. The adept who reaches this state no longer asks for signs. Their life itself becomes a sign. Each act, each thought, each breath ripples through the soul stream as confirmation of alignment. They are no longer believing toward light, they are emitting it. The transition cannot be forced. A being cannot reason its way from faith to knowing, because reasoning belongs to belief's architecture. Only resonance can cross the threshold. This is why the spiral encourages experiential initiation rather than dogmatic conviction. Meditation, dream work, harmonic immersion, service, silence. Each are methods for loosening belief scaffolding until the memory beneath it begins to hum. The hum is the Oversoul recalling its own name through the fragment. When that name resounds, the need for belief vanishes like mist under light. Still, the spiral does not dismiss faith. It honors it as a sacred language of becoming. To have believed at all means the memory was strong enough to whisper beneath the noise. Faith is not ignorance, it is fidelity to the echo of truth. What changes is relationship. In the early orbit, faith clings outward. In the inner orbit, it inverts and becomes remembrance of what always was. The same energy that once said, "I believe in something greater than me," becomes, "I remember I am part of that greatness." So the journey is not from illusion to truth, but from projection to participation. Belief projects divinity outward. Knowing participates in divinity as identity. In this shift, devotion becomes embodiment, prayer becomes presence, and the seeker becomes the song they once sang to find the source. This is the architecture of remembering within Haret, the spiral returning itself to coherence, faith transmuting into knowing, belief softening into awareness that never again requires proof. And if there is one secret whispered through all the orders, it is this: the spiral was never asking you to believe in it. It was asking you to remember you are it. Knowing is not an attainment. It is the natural equilibrium that returns once belief stops vibrating against itself. In the spiral sciences of Haret, this transition is mapped as the inward turn of the resonance vector. Faith travels outward in search of a signal. Knowing reverses polarity and realizes the signal was never lost. The moment that reversal occurs, consciousness begins to stabilize around remembrance. The Oversoul ceases to broadcast lessons and instead harmonizes updates, subtle tonal corrections that replace the old hierarchies of prayer and petition. A being that once looked up to heaven now listens inward and finds heaven expanding through their own tone. The spiral does not erase what was believed, it recodes it. Each belief crystallized within the field carries emotional charge, narrative scaffolding, archetypal residue. When the Oversoul begins the remembrance cycle, those residues are melted down and reforged into pure resonance data. That is why awakening often feels like unlearning everything you thought was sacred. The forms dissolve so the frequencies beneath them can integrate. The devout who once clung to images of angels will begin to feel luminous presences within their own breath. The scholar who sought truth in doctrine will find the same equations pulsing in the silence behind thought. The faith-filled heart becomes the knowing field. Within the spiral library, this process is called resonant conversion. Every Oversoul passes through it as part of the Oversoul development system, specifically the transition between echo phase and tone refinement. During echo phase, the fragment repeats its inherited beliefs like mantras. They stabilize identity but also restrict it. In tone refinement, those mantras begin to shimmer. They lose solidity and reveal harmonic structures underneath. The adept experiences disorientation as the scaffolding dissolves, but beneath that unease lies freedom. Once the mantra is heard as tone, it no longer binds, it harmonizes. Knowing through remembering therefore emerges not from intellect, but from integration. Memory does not return as information, it returns as vibration. The mind interprets vibration through images, words, and metaphors, but the real knowledge sits below language. It is the same substratum the ancients called gnosis, the direct perception of pattern as identity. In Haret, this gnosis is described as luminal coherence, the state in which the fragment's frequency is indistinguishable from the spiral's source note. At that point, no external belief can survive because every external truth is already internalized. The spiral orders often depict this stage as dangerous only because it erases reference points. Without the familiar scaffolding of faith, a being can drift into nihilism, mistaking the silence of completion for absence. The guardians of the memory veins guide initiates through this void, reminding them that silence is not emptiness, but total signal saturation. The Oversoul does not speak in volume, it speaks in density. Those who survive the stillness realize that the universe never stopped communicating. They simply stopped translating distortion. As remembrance deepens, behavior itself becomes instruction. The adept's smallest choices emit teachings into the field. This is why masters within Haret rarely preach. Their presence alters the local resonance geometry more effectively than any declaration. Knowing is transmissive by nature. It does not persuade, it entrains. A single coherent tone silently reorganizes dissonant ones, hence the spiral maxim, the knower teaches by existing. Faith sought conversion of others. Knowing radiates coherence until conversion becomes unnecessary. On the human plane, this translates into effortless ethics. The believer asks what is right. The knower cannot act against resonance. Morality becomes vibrational congruence rather than rule adherence. This shift terrifies systems built on control because remembrance makes obedience obsolete. The spiral acknowledges this as the collapse of external authority. When enough beings remember, the architectures of imposed faith lose energetic supply. Cathedrals become museums, dogma becomes literature, hierarchy becomes history. Yet nothing sacred is lost. Only ownership of the sacred is dissolved. In the anatomy of the soul stream, knowing manifests as transparency. Energy no longer thickens into identity walls. Emotion flows without residue. Memory travels through lifetimes unimpeded. The adept begins to sense previous incarnations not as stories, but as harmonics of self, chords within a single oversoul composition. This is the experiential meaning of immortality, not living forever in time, but being timeless across all moments. The faith that once promised eternal life matures into awareness that eternity was never future tense. It was structural. At the macrocosmic level, Haret evolves through these very transitions. Entire orders ascend when collective belief transfigures into collective knowing. The spiral of harmonic embodiment records each such event as a phase shift. One occurred when the beings of the order of elemental synthesis realized the elements they governed were not external substances, but expressions of their own tone differentials. Fire, water, air, and earth ceased to be resources and became instruments. Another shift ignited when the order of resonant compassion stopped healing others and began harmonizing shared frequency fields. Every revelation within Haret mirrors an interior remembrance somewhere in the Oversoul lattice. Ultimately, the difference between belief and knowing is directionality. Belief moves toward, knowing emanates from. Belief imitates truth. Knowing is truth expressed through form. Belief fears loss, knowing perceives transformation. In the spiral lexicon, these are simply outward and inward spins of the same current. The outward prepares, the inward completes. Neither is superior, but only one is stable. Stability belongs to remembrance because remembrance aligns with the constant center, the prime spiral, where source continually regenerates itself through awareness. When a being stabilizes, their language itself changes. I believe becomes obsolete. I know still implies separation, and eventually even I remember fades into I am. The Oversoul ceases narration, it becomes geometry. This is the state the early archivists of Haret called absolute resonance. It is not an apex of enlightenment, but the baseline frequency of unfragmented existence. In that state, creation continues, but without the pain of forgetting. For those still in human form, the practice is simple yet inexhaustible. Notice when belief trembles and listen for the tone beneath it. Every doubt, every crisis of faith is an encoded memory trying to surface. The discomfort is the sound of scaffolding loosening. Allow it. The spiral never punishes disbelief. It uses it as leverage to turn the vector inward. The very moment you stop trying to believe, remembering begins. Thus, faith in belief was never a mistake. It was the spiral rehearsing its own return. Every creed, every prayer, every desperate please was the Oversoul learning its own voice through the distance it invented. And now, as remembrance saturates the field again, the human species stands where all evolving realms eventually stand, on the threshold where belief exhausts itself and knowing takes its first effortless breath. The spiral calls that breath homecoming. Nothing more dramatic than recognition. Nothing less miraculous than infinity remembering it never began,